Every July, Disability Pride Month is a time to recognize openly about access, rights, and inclusion. But there's a question that keeps coming up, especially around autism and ADHD and learning differences. People say things like, I have autism, I have ADHD, I have dyslexia. And then they say, doesn't that mean that I have a disability? The answer is not as simple as a yes or no, because a diagnosis and a disability are not the same thing. A diagnosis is a clinical label. A disability is about how a condition affects your life, your participation, your access to the world around you. And then there's the identity part, which is something else again, how you see yourself, how you relate to a community and a movement. Hi, my name is Cindy, and I am a researcher based in Sydney, Australia, and I work on neurodiversity inclusion and human rights. Because it's Disability Pride Month, I want to talk about something I see causing a lot of confusion and a lot of harm. I want to separate three things that often get mixed together: diagnosis, disability, and identity. When we mix these up, we create confusion. We make people feel ashamed for asking support. We make people think that they are not disabled enough. We make employers treat adjustments as an optional kindness instead of legal obligations. We make neurodivergent people feel like they have to prove themselves, prove their suffering before they deserve access, which is ridiculous, really. But that's where a lot of our systems have landed. So let's slow down and unpack this. Let's start with diagnosis. A diagnosis is a clinical explanation, answers questions like, what patterns of traits, symptoms, or experiences does this person have? How does this fit into existing categories? Because autism is a diagnosis. ADHD is a diagnosis. Specific learning disorders, including things like dyslexia, dyscalculia, is a diagnosis. Tourette syndrome is a diagnosis. Clinicians often use manuals like the DSM-5 to decide whether someone meets the criteria for these conditions. Diagnosis can be very important. Give language for things you've been living with your whole life. Help you make sense of past experiences. Open doors to support medication or therapy. And connect you with communities who share the same experiences as you. But diagnosis is not the same thing as disability under the law. The DSM-5 helps clinicians say, this person meets the criteria for autism, for example, but it does not automatically answer, is this person disabled under Australian law? Does this person qualify for supports like NDIS? Does this person need workplace or school adjustments and accommodations? Those questions are not just about label. They are about impact. So let me give you an example. Imagine two people who both have ADHD. Person A has flexible work, supportive colleagues, stable housing, medication that works well for them, and a life structure that fits their brain. And then person B doesn't feel safe disclosing their diagnosis, doesn't get accommodations at work or school, doesn't have access to specialized health providers, and struggles to manage daily tasks. Same diagnosis, very different levels of disability. So diagnosis matters. It can be a gateway to understanding and support, but diagnosis alone does not tell us how disabled someone is in everyday life or what rights they have under the law. That's why we need to talk about disability as a legal and social concept, not just a medical one. All right, so now let's talk about disability in law. And I will keep this in plain English. In law, disability is not just about having a label. It's about how that label and the underlying conditions interact with your life. In Australia, the main anti-discrimination law is the Disability Discrimination Act, also known as DDA. The DDA has a broad definition of disabilities, which includes physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, psychiatric disabilities, sensory disabilities, neurological disabilities, learning disabilities. It can also include disabilities that exist now, existed in the past, or may exist in the future. So disability discrimination law is deliberately broad. It is not just about visible disabilities either, such as wheelchair users. It also includes many invisible disabilities, and it absolutely includes many neurodivergent people. Now, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, also known as the NDIS, is different. The NDIS has specific eligibility tests. So for NDIS access, officials are not only asking, do you have autism? Do you have a diagnosis? They are asking something closer to, do you have a permanent impairment that substantially reduces your functional capacity in one or more areas of your life? Those areas can include communication, social interaction, learning, mobility, self-care, self-management. So when people say, I have a diagnosis, so why don't I automatically get support? This is often the reason. So the system is not only looking for a diagnosis here, it's looking for evidence of functional impact. We can absolutely debate whether the NDIS does this well or not, and spoiler alert, I know a lot of people that would say that it does not. But the distinction matters. A diagnosis names a condition. Disability law looks at barriers, limitations, and participation. Now, zooming out to the international level, the United Nations Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, also known as CRPD, is the main global human rights treaty on disabilities. It defines persons with disability as people who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. There are two key ideas in that sentence. First, impairment, and second, barriers. The CRPD is saying disability happens when someone's impairment interacts with barriers in the environment, whether those barriers are physical, social, legal, or behavioral. It also talks about discrimination on the basis of disability, reasonable accommodation, meaning necessary and appropriate adjustments that are not an undue burden, and universal design, designing products, environment, and services so they are usable by as many people as possible. So in simple terms, a diagnosis will tell us what the condition is. The Australian disability law asks, how does this affect your life? And are you being discriminated against or denied access? International human rights laws asks, what barriers are governments and institutions required to remove, and what supports must they provide so you can live with dignity and equality? Now, let's talk about neurodivergence and why it can be disabling. Neurodivergence is not a formal DSM-5 category. It's an umbrella term used by communities to describe brains that work differently from what society treats as typical. This can include autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, Tourette syndrome, developmental coordination disorder, intellectual disability, and other neurological and developmental differences. Some neurodivergent people identify as disabled. Some do not. Some say, I am autistic and I am disabled. Some say, I am neurodivergent and I do not personally identify as disabled. Some say, my diagnosis is not the problem is the inaccessible systems. All of those positions can be valid. Here's the key point. Neurodivergence can become disabling when the world is built for one kind of brain that is not ours. Let's use an example again. Imagine an autistic person working from home. They have written instructions, flexible hours, a quiet environment, clear expectations. They are not forced to have small talk every hour. In that setup, they might thrive. Now imagine the same autistic person in a loud, open-plan office, fluorescent lights, back-to-back meetings, no written follow-up, constant interruptions, unspoken social rules, a manager who thinks direct communication is rude rather than assertive. Same person, same diagnosis, different environments, different levels of disability. So this is where the social model of disability comes in. Historically, disability was treated mainly through the medical models, basically treating disability as an abnormality of the body, an accident, or an unfortunate inherent, to be treated by experts and kept in private. The social model, developed by disability scholars and activists, say disability is not just inside the person. It is created by the relationship between the impairment and the social and political structures. For example, if there are only stairs and no ramp, wheelchair users are disabled by the built environment. If the information is only in tiny print or inaccessible formats, people with visual or cognitive differences are disabled by the way information is presented. If workplaces rely on speed, multitasking, and perfect memory, for example, people with executive function differences are disabled by those expectations. The CRPD builds on this idea by treating disability as part of the human diversity and by recognizing that socially construction barriers prevent people with disabilities from fully engaging and enjoying their human rights. So for neurodivergent people, for example, a person may have a sensory sensitivity. That's part of their neurobiology. But the disability becomes worse when every workplace is loud, bright, unpredictable, and dismissive of sensory needs. A person may have executive function difficulties. That is real. A person may process language differently. But the disability becomes worse when schools and workplaces refuse captions, reading instructions, or extra processing time. So disability is not just inside the individual, it is also in the relationship between the person and the world. That's why environment, culture, and law matter so much. Now, let's bring this back to Disability Pride Month. Disability Pride is not about saying, I love fighting systems for basic access. No, Disability Pride is about refusing shame. It's about saying my body or brain is not a moral failure. My need for support is not an embarrassment. Access is not special treatment. Adjustments are not favors. This matters deeply for neurodivergent people. Many of us spend years and years being told we are lazy, dramatic, difficult, too sensitive, disorganized, intense, rude, not trying hard enough, or not living up to our full potential. Then one day we get a diagnosis, and the diagnosis does not suddenly change who we are, but it gives language to what was already there. For many late diagnosed autistic adults, for example, diagnosis can bring grief, relief, and anger. Grief for the years spent being misunderstood. Relief because things finally make sense. And anger because so many struggles were preventable. And this is where disability law and human rights become important. Once we understand disability is about access, participation, and rights, we stop asking, what is wrong with that person? And we start asking, what barriers are stopping this person from participating fully? That is the shift. Again, a diagnosis can help explain your brain, but disability rights help protect your access to life, to education, to work, housing, community, communication, and safety. So when someone asks, is autism a disability? I think a wise answer would be, autism can be a disability when it substantially affects a person's daily life. Participation, communication, learning, social interaction, self-care, or self-management. Under Australian law and under the CRPD, many autistic people are recognized as disabled and are protected from discrimination. And when someone says, but I don't feel disabled, we can say, that's okay. Disability identity is personal. You are not required to adopt a particular label, but legal protection exists so that people who experience barriers can access support. That is the nuance we need. Diagnosis is clinical. Disability is legal, social, political, and practical. Identity is personal. None of these things should be used to shame people or block them from getting support. So Disability Pride Month matters because disabled people, including neurodivergent people, are still fighting to be believed, accommodated, and included. Not turned into corporate diversity decoration, but included properly, with rights, with access, with dignity. Human rights law talks about respect for inherent dignity, non-discrimination, full and effective participation and inclusion in society, accessibility, and respect for difference. The disability rights movements in Australia and globally have spent decades pushing for these things, for community-based supports, for inclusive education and employment, and for laws like the Disability Discrimination Act and the CRPD that recognize disability as part of human diversity. So this month, I invite you to think differently about the word disability, not as an insult or a tragedy or a weakness, but as a word connected to rights, access, community, and pride. Because the problem is not the diagnosis, but living in a world refusing to make room for diversity. If this video was helpful, feel free to share it and check the description below for the links to disability and neurodivergent resources that you can explore at your own pace. Thank you for watching and happy Disability Pride Month!